In the spring of 1957, in a quiet corner of northern England, a town already marked by tragedy gathered itself around an event that should have been cause for celebration. The hospital was modest, a brick building that stood against the constant drizzle of the region, its windows clouded with condensation, its wards filled with the familiar scent of antiseptic and the muffled rhythm of footsteps on polished linoleum floors. On the morning of October 4th, a pair of cries echoed through the maternity ward, 2 newborn girls, identical twins, their arrival greeted with relief, awe, and something heavier that would not be spoken aloud. The parents, John and Florence, should have been overwhelmed with joy. After all, the girls were strong, their tiny fingers curling instinctively around their mother's hand, their breathing steady and untroubled. But for John and Florence, joy could never fully eclipse the lingering shadow that hung over the family. Just a year earlier, their 2 older daughters, Joanna and Jacqueline, had been killed in a devastating car accident only streets away from their home. The loss had broken something in them that no new birth could entirely repair. The funeral had left scars, not only on the family, but on the entire community of Hexham-on-Tyne, a town where everyone knew each other's faces, where news traveled faster than the river's current, and where grief was shared like a common burden. Neighbors came with congratulations, flowers, and food, yet behind their warm words and polite smiles was a silent question no one dared ask aloud. What place would these new children hold in the shadow of the 2 who had been lost? For Florence, the question lingered. With every moment she held the twins in her arms. She named them Gillian and Jennifer, names chosen not to echo the departed daughters but to allow the newborns to begin fresh lives. Yet, from the beginning, Florence could not shake the sensation that she was raising children who somehow carried echoes of the past within them. Outside the hospital, the town itself bore the look of an English village caught between centuries. Stone cottages pressed close together on narrow streets, smoke curling from chimneys even in early autumn, the sound of coal deliveries rattling along cobblestones, a church spire cut into the grey sky, its bells marking time in a place where time seemed otherwise unmoving. And as villagers whispered about the twins' birth, the memory of the accident that had taken Joanna and Jacqueline returned to the forefront of conversation. People said the new children were a blessing, a sign of healing, even divine consolation. But others spoke more cautiously, their voices low, their eyes darting. They wondered if fate, or something beyond fate, was at work. In later years, Florence would recall moments from those first weeks that troubled her. She remembered Jennifer's birthmark, a dark smudge across her left hip, strangely similar in placement to Jacqueline's fatal wound. She remembered Gillian's fascination with a spot on the hospital ceiling, where no one else could see anything unusual. And she remembered how, as she held them both, she felt not only the warmth of life beginning anew, but also the weight of something old, something unresolved, pressing into her embrace. For now, the babies were quiet, innocent, their eyes shut tight against the blinding lights of the ward. But soon those eyes would open, and with them would come words, names, and memories that should have belonged to others. In a town already marked by whispers and grief, the arrival of Gillian and Jennifer would become not only a story of healing, but also one of the most unsettling mysteries in modern memory. Because sometimes, when the world loses, it does not truly let go. Sometimes, it remembers in ways that challenge everything we think we know about life, death, and the mind. And as we begin this story, I invite you to think carefully. What would you do if your child began speaking of events they could never have known, of lives they never lived? Leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe if mysteries like these capture your imagination, because this story is only the beginning. The twins came home to a house that had not yet released its grief. On Oak Street, where the Pollock family lived, the windows still bore the faint reflections of black ribbons from the funeral held only months before. Neighbors who stopped by with baskets of food and knitted blankets would smile at the sight of Gillian and Jennifer, but their voices often faltered when they caught sight of the photographs on the mantel. 2 smiling girls in summer dresses, Joanna and Jacqueline, immortalized in the stillness of framed memory. Their absence was a presence as solid as any wall in that house. John, the father, tried to move forward with quiet determination. He believed in faith, in divine justice, in the possibility that what had been taken might somehow be restored. God works in patterns, he often told himself, though he never explained what patterns he imagined. Florence, however, was not soothed by such reassurances. She was a practical woman, grounded in the rhythm of laundry, cooking, and tending to the twins' every cry. Yet in the silence between chores, when she caught sight of an empty chair or heard the faint echo of children's laughter that no longer existed, her heart clenched with the ache of memory. The town itself mirrored this duality. Hexham-on-Tyne was small, with cobbled streets winding like old veins through clusters of stone houses. The shops sold practical goods: bread, wool, coal, and second-hand clothes. Farmers from the surrounding countryside arrived each Saturday with baskets of eggs and milk, their horses steaming in the cold morning air. Yet beneath the ordinariness, there lingered something solemn. The accident that had taken Joanna and Jacqueline had been the talk of every pub and church pew for months. People had watched the ambulance lights flare against the grey buildings, had stood at their doors as the sirens pierced the quiet. For many, the memory was still too fresh to dismiss. Florence often noticed how neighbours would pause when passing her home. Some offered blessings, convinced that the birth of twins so soon after tragedy was a sign of divine favour. Others whispered to one another, eyes filled with unease. In a place where superstition clung to the stones as firmly as moss, it was not difficult for people to wonder whether the Pollocks' new daughters carried more than just their parents' blood. Inside the home, daily life unfolded with the rhythm of any household raising infants, crying in the night, bottles warming on the stove, the slow rocking of cradles. Yet the past was never far away. Florence kept the older girls' belongings stored in boxes in the attic. Dresses with frayed hems, school exercise books filled with handwriting that would never continue, toys worn smooth by small hands. She avoided those boxes whenever possible, but sometimes, when she climbed to the attic for other things, the sight of them would unravel her resolve. She feared that even glancing at those items might blur the fragile boundary between the living and the lost. And yet, there were moments when Florence could not deny an uncanny sensation. Once, while nursing Jennifer, she caught the baby staring at a corner of the room with a focus far too intense for her age. The infant's eyes followed something invisible. And then, with a small, unsteady motion, she smiled, an expression eerily reminiscent of Jacqueline. Another time, Gillian cried uncontrollably until Florence brought her into the garden, where she quieted instantly, gazing toward the path where Joanna used to play. These were coincidences, Florence told herself. Babies often behaved strangely, but in the quiet recesses of her mind, she wondered if her daughters had truly left at all. For John, the strange moments were not cause for fear, but for faith. He saw in them not echoes of loss, but signs of continuity. He had always believed that the soul could not be destroyed, only transformed. When Gillian's hand curled around his finger with a grip that seemed oddly familiar, he whispered to Florence, "They're still with us, you see. God has given them back." Florence said nothing in reply, unwilling to dismiss his comfort but unable to accept it fully. To her, the twins were new, fragile, and deserving of lives unshadowed by tragedy. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. As the twins grew, the town adjusted. Some villagers embraced the narrative of divine return, weaving it into their sermons and gossip alike. Others muttered that the Pollock house was marked by something uncanny. It was not long before Florence began noticing patterns that could no longer be dismissed as imagination, patterns that hinted at memories carried not by herself or John, but by the daughters who should not have remembered anything at all. It began subtly, in ways that Florence at first dismissed as coincidence. Infants, after all, develop quirks that parents often misinterpret, but over time, the small incidents accumulated into something she could no longer ignore. One afternoon, when the twins were barely 2 years old, Florence was unpacking a box of toys from the attic. She had not meant for the children to see them. These toys had belonged to Joanna and Jacqueline, and Florence had hidden them away to prevent the past from spilling too easily into the present. But in her distraction, she left the box open on the kitchen table. Gillian, toddling past, caught sight of a small worn doll with a missing arm. Without hesitation, she pointed and exclaimed a name that froze Florence in place. Mary. The name had never been taught to her. It was the name Joanna had given that doll years earlier, a detail Florence had never spoken aloud in front of the twins. Jennifer, standing beside her sister, reached for the doll, and clutched it tightly, rocking it in her arms with a familiarity that seemed far beyond her years. Florence said nothing, but her heart pounded with unease. Later, when John came home, Florence told him what had happened. He smiled, almost with relief. "Don't you see?" he said. "It's them. God gave them back." Florence bristled at his certainty. She wanted to believe in miracles, but what she saw felt stranger, less comforting. It wasn't just memory that seemed to return. It was behavior, habits, little fragments of identity that belonged to girls buried in the churchyard. As months passed, the incidents multiplied. Jennifer would ask for toys that no longer existed, describing them with unsettling accuracy. "Where's my pushcart?" she once demanded, referring to a toy that Jacqueline had adored. When Florence gently asked her what she meant, Jennifer described it in detail. The chipped paint, the squeak of its wheels, the way it leaned slightly to one side. Florence knew the cart had been thrown away years ago. After the accident, there was no way Jennifer could have seen it. Gillian, meanwhile, developed an attachment to a corner of the garden where Joanna had once played endlessly with chalk and skipping ropes. One morning, Gillian walked out with unsteady steps, pointed at the patch of cracked stone, and said, "This is where I used to play." The words were spoken with such innocent conviction that Florence nearly dropped the laundry basket she was carrying. She had told herself never to react too strongly, never to frighten the girls with her own unease. But in moments like these, the fragile wall she had built between the past and present crumbled. Neighbors began to notice too. During a visit, a family friend saw Jennifer cradle a stuffed animal and call it by the nickname that Jacqueline had invented. How would she know that? The friend asked in a hushed tone when Florence tried to brush it off. Rumors spread through Hexham on Tyne, whispered in shops and muttered after Sunday service. Some said the twins were blessed with divine memory. Others muttered that the house was haunted, that the souls of the dead girls had not moved on. One particular incident cemented Florence's unease. The twins had been walking with her through town when they passed the schoolyard. Jennifer suddenly pulled at her hand and shouted, "That's where I used to go." She ran toward the gate, pointing at the building as if it belonged to her. Gillian joined in, nodding, saying she remembered the swings in the yard. The schoolmaster, who overheard the commotion, looked at Florence with an expression of confusion and pity. "They couldn't possibly remember that," he whispered. By the time the girls were 3, Florence had begun keeping a notebook. In careful handwriting, she documented each instance. The names of toys, the places remembered, the phrases spoken with eerie precision. Her notes read less like a mother's musings and more like the beginnings of a case file. She wrote because she did not trust her memory, because she feared one day she might try to convince herself that none of it had really happened. But as the entries grew, filling page after page, denial became impossible. John's reaction to these events remained steady, almost stubbornly so. To him, every uncanny moment was a reaffirmation of his belief. The souls of Joanna and Jacqueline had returned, reincarnated into new bodies. He prayed aloud in thanks, spoke to the twins as though they were continuations of his lost daughters, and told Florence to embrace the miracle. But Florence resisted. To her, miracles should comfort, not unsettle, and what was happening in her home filled her with a quiet dread, because when Gillian laughed, sometimes it was Joanna's laugh, the exact same cadence, as if echoing from another time, and when Jennifer frowned, her expression mirrored Jacqueline's so precisely that Florence felt as though she was staring at a child who had already died once. It was becoming clear that these were not ordinary coincidences. The twins were beginning to display signs that they carried not just the blood of their parents, but the memories of lives that had ended before their own began. And Florence, despite her efforts to remain rational, could not shake the feeling that the past was seeping back into the present through her children. Florence had noticed the marks at birth, but in those early days, she had been too overwhelmed with exhaustion and grief to think much of them. Every baby, after all, is born with blemishes, small patches of color on the skin, freckles that darken with time, little imperfections that parents learn to love. But as the girls grew, the marks did not fade. Instead, they became sharper, more defined, as though they carried meaning that no one wanted to admit. Jennifer, the younger of the two by minutes, bore a dark, oval-shaped mark on her left hip. It was irregular, about the size of a coin, and Florence often rubbed her thumb across it absent-mindedly when bathing her daughter. To most, it would have looked like an ordinary birthmark, but to Florence, who had identified her daughter Jacqueline's body after the accident, the resemblance was chilling. The mark was precisely where Jacqueline had been struck, the site of a deep wound that the coroner had described with clinical detachment. Gillian's mark was subtler, a faint line across her forehead, pale but distinct enough that it looked almost like a scar. Florence had thought at first it was nothing more than a crease of the skin, but with time it became clear it was permanent. The memory of Joanna lying in the hospital, a gash across her brow from where her head had struck the pavement, came rushing back every time Florence saw it. The two marks together felt less like coincidence and more like some cruel symmetry, a rewriting of tragedy on the bodies of children who should have been untouched by the past. John, when Florence pointed out these details, only nodded with calm conviction. "Proof," he said softly. "Do you see, Florence? Proof that souls return." His certainty unsettled her. To him, the marks were a sign of divine design, but to her, they seemed a kind of haunting. Why would God place wounds upon new life if the purpose was comfort? Why not allow them to come whole and unscarred? Florence asked these questions silently, never aloud, but the unease grew inside her with each passing month. By the time the twins were old enough to toddle through the house, the marks had become subjects of conversation. Relatives noticed. "Strange little thing," an aunt remarked, tapping Jennifer's hip as she dressed her for bed. "Looks almost like a bruise." Neighbors whispered when Gillian played in the garden, her pale line visible beneath the fringe of her bangs. Florence tried to deflect, to call them ordinary, but the whispers spread, woven into the tapestry of town gossip, until Hexamon Tyne seemed to look at the twins not as ordinary children, but as carriers of something uncanny. What disturbed Florence even more were the children's own reactions. Jennifer, when asked about the mark on her hip, once patted it with her tiny hand and said, "That's where the car hit me." Florence froze. "What do you mean, darling?" she asked gently, forcing calm into her voice. But Jennifer had already moved on, distracted by her toys. Gillian, for her part, sometimes touched her forehead, absent-mindedly, saying, "It hurt here once." These statements were not rehearsed, not coaxed out of them. They slipped from the girls as naturally as any child might comment on a scraped knee or a stubbed toe. Florence began to write these comments into her notebook as well, underlining them twice. She could not decide what terrified her more, the idea that her daughters were carrying the wounds of the past, or that she might one day be forced to explain why. She wondered whether her children would grow up defined by these memories, unable to separate their own identities from the lives of Joanna and Jacqueline. The turning point came one quiet evening, when Florence was preparing the twins for bed. Gillian was playing with a comb, pretending to style her sister's hair, when she looked up suddenly and said, "Jacqueline had hair like this. She liked to brush it herself." Jennifer nodded in agreement, and then pointed to her hip, declaring again, "That's where I was hurt." Florence, overcome, sat down heavily in the chair beside the crib. She felt as though she had been pulled into a loop of time, forced to relive the same grief in a new form. John, hearing the commotion, came in and wrapped his arms around Florence's shoulders. "Don't be afraid," he whispered. "This is a gift." But Florence could not shake the dread that pressed against her chest. It did not feel like a gift. It felt like the past refusing to die, like tragedy embedding itself in new flesh. Over the following weeks, the children continued to make references, unprompted, to injuries and experiences they could not possibly have known. Gillian once asked her mother if the blood was gone now, though she had never been told of the accident. Jennifer woke crying from a dream, clutching her hip, sobbing that the car was coming again. Florence held her tightly, whispering reassurances, but deep down, she knew that these nightmares were not ordinary products of childhood imagination. By now, the notebook Florence kept was thick with accounts, descriptions of marks, of statements, of dreams that aligned with memories belonging to the dead. The evidence was stacking, undeniable, and yet unexplainable. The girls were still so young, innocent in their play, unaware of how their words unsettled those around them. But Florence began to feel that each day was drawing her family closer to a truth she both longed to understand and feared to confront. And in the town beyond her doorstep, the whispers were turning into questions. What does it mean when children bear the wounds of the dead? Were Gillian and Jennifer simply products of grief, molded by parents and community who could not let go? Or were they living proof that the boundaries between death and life were far thinner than anyone dared imagine? The attic of the Pollock home was a place Florence avoided whenever possible. Dust lay thick on the beams, and the boxes stacked there contained more than just objects. They contained memories too heavy to disturb, dresses too small for the twins but perfect for Joanna and Jacqueline, exercise books filled with childish handwriting, hair ribbons still faintly smelling of soap and lavender, and among them, a collection of toys that had once scattered across bedroom floors, now sealed away like relics. John had often suggested bringing the toys down. They are theirs too, he argued. Why shouldn't the twins have what belonged to their sisters? Florence resisted at first, afraid of what might surface, but eventually, one autumn afternoon, when the girls were nearly 4, John decided to test his conviction. He climbed into the attic, coughing through the dust, and returned with a wooden box that had not been opened since the accident. He placed the box in the sitting room where the fire crackled low and the twins played on the carpet. "Go on," he said softly. "See what you think." Florence stood behind him, arms folded, heart racing. She knew what was inside that box. A set of dolls, stuffed animals, a tea set, a pushcart with a broken wheel. She had packed them herself in the days after the funeral, her tears soaking the cardboard as she sealed it. The twins approached with hesitation, then curiosity. Gillian was the first to reach inside, her small hand brushing against fabric and wood, until she pulled out a doll with painted blue eyes and a cracked porcelain face. Without pause, she cradled it against her chest. "This is Susan," she said matter-of-factly. Florence's breath caught in her throat. Susan had been Joanna's favorite doll, named without rhyme or reason years earlier. No one had spoken that name in front of the twins. John, stunned but smiling, whispered a prayer under his breath. Jennifer, meanwhile, reached deeper into the box and produced a stuffed animal, a rabbit with one ear torn. She hugged it tightly, rocking back and forth as though soothing it. "Mine," she declared. "This was mine." She then turned to her mother and asked why the ear was still broken, as though expecting it to have healed. Florence knelt, her hands trembling. "How do you know that, darling?" she asked. Jennifer frowned, as if the question were absurd. "Because it was always mine, Jacqueline's rabbit." She used her own name, the name of the sister who had died, as if it were her own identity. The room fell silent, except for the crackle of the fire. Gillian was now setting out the toy tea set, arranging the cups with practiced precision. "Joanna liked this best," she said, pouring imaginary tea with the seriousness of a hostess. She gestured to the space beside her, as though inviting someone unseen to join. John's eyes glistened with tears, his faith vindicated in a way he believed beyond doubt. "Do you see?" he murmured to Florence. "Do you see now?" But Florence could only stare at her daughters with a mix of awe and dread. She wanted to scoop them up, to insist that they were new children, free of the past. And yet, how could she deny what she had just witnessed? Names, preferences, habits, all aligning with the lives of children who no longer breathed. Over the following weeks, the toys became fixtures in the twins' play. They argued over them in ways eerily reminiscent of Joanna and Jacqueline. Gillian insisted on setting the tea set just so, scolding Jennifer for not arranging the cups properly, exactly the way Joanna had once scolded her younger sister. Jennifer, for her part, clung fiercely to the rabbit, refusing to let anyone else touch it, just as Jacqueline once had. Family members who visited were left unsettled. An uncle watched as Gillian lined up the dolls in a particular order and remarked, "That's exactly how Joanna used to do it." A cousin laughed nervously when Jennifer demanded that her mother sew a patch onto a dress that had been Jacqueline's, declaring it was her favorite and always had been. Florence's notebook filled with new entries, each one more disturbing than the last. She wrote down the names, the arguments, the routines that mirrored the past. And as she wrote, she wondered, were the twins simply absorbing details overheard in whispers, piecing together a story from the grief that surrounded them? Or were they genuinely recalling lives that had ended before their own began? The most chilling moment came one evening as Florence was preparing the girls for bed. Jennifer clutched the rabbit tightly and whispered, Don't let the car come again." When Florence asked what she meant, Jennifer looked at her with wide, solemn eyes. "It hurt me before. I don't want it to hurt me again." Florence held her daughter until she fell asleep, tears streaming silently down her own face. She wanted to believe it was only a child's imagination, but the conviction in Jennifer's voice told her otherwise. By now, the evidence was no longer just coincidence or passing remarks. The toys had become conduits, unlocking memories and identities that should have been buried with Joanna and Jacqueline. And though John rejoiced, convinced his daughters had returned, Florence began to feel trapped in a narrative she had not chosen. She loved Gillian and Jennifer fiercely, but she feared that their lives were being eclipsed by ghosts. The toys, once symbols of innocence, had become proof of something Florence could neither explain nor deny. Proof that the line between past and present had blurred in her own home. For a time, Florence tried to keep the strange behaviors of her daughters within the confines of the home. She feared gossip, feared the judgment of neighbors who might accuse her of feeding her grief into the minds of her children. But in a town as small as Hexham on Tyne, secrets were fragile things. It did not take long before the twins' uncanny remarks began spilling beyond the threshold of the Pollock house. The first witness outside the family was Florence's sister, Mary. She had come to visit one Saturday afternoon, bringing sweets wrapped in brown paper. As she bent to greet the girls, Jennifer ran up to her with arms outstretched and said, "You used to take me to the park on Sundays." Mary froze, glancing at Florence in confusion. "What does she mean?" she asked. Florence forced a smile, brushing it off as childish imagination. But Jennifer persisted, describing in detail a particular swing at the park, the one with paint peeling on one side and a creak in the chain. Mary knew at once. It was the very swing Jacqueline had loved. Word spread quietly among relatives. A cousin visiting from Newcastle overheard Gillian scolding Jennifer during play. "Don't be silly, you're the little one," Gillian said sharply, echoing Joanna's tone so perfectly that the cousin was left pale. Later, she confided to Florence. It was as if Joanna herself was speaking. The same voice, the same manner. Neighbors began to notice too. One evening, Mrs. Henderson, who lived across the street, stopped by to deliver eggs. As she stood in the doorway, she heard Jennifer call from the stairs, "Don't forget the way to school tomorrow, Mama." The words were innocuous enough, except for one detail. Neither twin was yet old enough for school, and neither had been shown the building. But Jennifer described the route with startling accuracy. The turn past the church, the narrow lane by the bakery, the red door that marked the entrance. Mrs. Henderson's face drained of color. How could she possibly know that? She whispered to Florence before leaving quickly, as though the air itself had grown heavy. The local vicar, Father Lewis, also became entangled in the whispers. After service one Sunday, he approached John and Florence with concern. "Some of the parishioners have spoken to me," he began carefully. "They say the girls speak of things they should not know." He hesitated, searching their faces. "I do not wish to alarm you, but some believe it to be divine intervention. Others—" He did not finish his sentence, but Florence understood. Others feared it was darker than that. By the time the twins turned 4, the stories had multiplied. A shopkeeper recalled Gillian insisting that she once bought sweets there with her sister, naming a brand that had been Joanna's favorite. A neighbor swore she heard Jennifer singing a lullaby unique to Jacqueline, a tune their mother had hummed only to her eldest daughters. Each account, small on its own, became threads in a tapestry that no one could dismiss. Florence's notebook grew thicker, but now she was not the only one recording. Relatives began writing down their experiences. Neighbors whispered them in letters, and soon the family found themselves surrounded by a body of testimony. 17 people, by some later count, could confirm hearing or witnessing statements from the twins that defied explanation. John embraced this widening circle of evidence. "The truth is clear," he said to anyone who would listen. "Reincarnation is real. My daughters have returned." His certainty gave comfort to some, but provoked unease in others. The town began to divide into 2 camps, those who believed the twins were living miracles, and those who feared they were touched by something unnatural. Florence stood at the center of it all, torn between love for her daughters and dread for what their lives were becoming. She noticed how people stared when she walked with the twins through the market, how conversations hushed when the girls spoke too freely. Once, when Gillian pointed to a passing car and whispered, "That's the one," Florence saw a neighbor cross herself and mutter a prayer. The children themselves seemed oblivious to the stir they were causing. To them, their words were simple truths, fragments of memory they carried as naturally as any child remembers yesterday's game. They did not understand why adults grew silent, why their mothers' eyes sometimes filled with tears. For Gillian and Jennifer, the past was not past. It was present, alive, stitched into their daily play and speech. One evening, after putting the twins to bed, Florence confided in her diary, "It is no longer just me. Others hear them too. I cannot deny it any longer. The girls are speaking with voices that do not belong to them, and the more they speak, the more I fear what lies ahead." With the evidence now spilling beyond the home, the case of the Pollock twins was no longer a private grief. It was becoming a public mystery, a story whispered in pubs, pondered in sermons, and carried in letters beyond the borders of Hexham on Tyne. And with that widening attention came an inevitability. Scrutiny, not just from curious neighbors, but from those who sought answers in the language of science. The first nightmare came when the twins were barely 4 years old. Florence was woken by the sound of Jennifer crying, not the whimpering of a restless child, but the sharp, desperate sobs of someone in real pain. She rushed into the bedroom to find Jennifer clutching her hip, her small face contorted in terror. Between gasps, the girl whispered, "The car. It's coming again. Don't let it come." Florence sat on the edge of the bed, gathering her daughter into her arms, whispering comfort. "It's only a dream, love. You're safe here." But Jennifer's trembling did not stop. She repeated the same words again and again, as though caught in a memory she could not escape. The following week, Gillian began to suffer similar disturbances. One night she bolted upright in bed, eyes wide with panic, crying, "My head hurts, it hurts." She clutched her forehead with both hands, rocking back and forth. When Florence asked what had happened, Gillian sobbed, "I fell and hit it on the ground when the car came. It was so loud. I don't want to fall again." Florence listened in silence, her heart thundering. She knew the details of the accident too well. The car that struck Joanna and Jacqueline, the cries of bystanders, the sight of her daughters broken on the pavement. She had never spoken of these details in front of the twins. Yet here were her new daughters, describing the same injuries, in the same places, with the same fear. Over the months that followed, the nightmares multiplied. Some nights one twin would wake, other nights both together, their cries echoing through the house like the chorus of old grief. They spoke of screeching tires, of glass breaking, of blood on the road. Sometimes their words overlapped, describing the same scene as though they had both lived it. Other times their accounts diverged, each carrying fragments that matched the sisters they had never met. Florence recorded each incident in her notebook, her handwriting shaky. One entry read, January 12th, 1961. Jennifer woke screaming, held her hip again, said, "It is where the wheel crushed me." Gillian woke shortly after, complained of her forehead. Both girls inconsolable for nearly half an hour. Same as last month. Same as always. John interpreted the nightmares differently. To him, they were not evidence of horror, but of continuity. "They remember because they are the same souls," he told Florence. "It frightens them now, but one day they will understand." His certainty no longer comforted her. Instead, it deepened her dread. What if their daughters were being forced to relive deaths they should never have remembered? What kind of life could grow from soil so haunted? The townspeople soon became aware of the girls' dreams. One afternoon, Jennifer fell asleep during a visit to her grandmother's cottage. She stirred and cried out in her sleep, repeating the words, "The car is coming, the car is coming." Her grandmother, shaken, crossed herself and whispered a prayer. "This is not normal," she said later to Florence. "Children do not dream of such things unless the past clings to them." Stories spread. Neighbors began repeating them as warnings or curiosities. The Pollock twins dream of their own deaths. Some whispered at the market, "They see the accident every night." In pubs, men told the story with awe, half believing, half dismissing, yet always compelled to retell it. The twins were no longer merely children of grief. They were becoming symbols of something unexplainable. The most disturbing dream came in the spring of 1961. Gillian woke in the early hours, sobbing violently, and between tears, she described not just the accident, but the moments before it. She spoke of walking hand in hand with her sister, of carrying a book wrapped in brown paper, of turning to look when they heard the sound of a horn. Florence knew this detail intimately. Joanna and Jacqueline had indeed been carrying books from the library that day, wrapped in brown paper to protect them from the drizzle. The fact had never been spoken aloud in the twins' presence. Florence's pen pressed hard into the notebook as she wrote it down, her hand trembling. She felt as though she were documenting not her daughter's dreams, but a crime scene revisited again and again. Over time, the girls began to anticipate the dreams. Jennifer would sometimes refuse to go to bed, whispering, "I don't want to see it again." Gillian would ask to sleep with the lamp left on, saying the darkness made the car come faster. Florence tried every comfort, songs, stories, prayers, but nothing stilled the nightmares. They came like clockwork, reminders of a past that would not rest. And so, the Pollock home lived in dual rhythms, the daytime world of ordinary play, laughter, and the chatter of children, and the nighttime world, where screams and sobs tore through the walls, dragging the family back into grief they could not escape. Florence wondered often whether she was witnessing the unraveling of her daughter's innocence, whether the memories would consume them. She prayed silently that as they grew older, the dreams might fade, leaving behind only ordinary childhood. But in her heart she feared the opposite, that the dreams were only the beginning of something far larger, something that reached beyond her understanding. The nightmares, once private agony, were soon to draw the attention of outsiders. Scholars, curious about the whispers from Hexham on Tyne, would soon arrive with notebooks of their own, seeking answers in the voices of children who remembered things they should never have known. By the summer of 1961, the story of the Pollock twins had spread far beyond Hexham on Tyne. What began as whispers among neighbours now reached the ears of academics, carried by letters, newspaper clippings, and the persistent fascination of those who sought meaning in the inexplicable. It was during this time that Dr. Harold McLean, a psychologist from Newcastle University, made his first visit to the Pollock home. McLean was not a man inclined towards superstition. He had spent his career studying child development, documenting the ways memory and imagination intertwined in young minds. To him, stories of reincarnation were curiosities, fascinating only as cultural phenomena. Yet when he heard of Gillian and Jennifer, he felt compelled to see for himself. At the very least, he would later write in his notes, it was a rare opportunity to examine how children construct identity from the fragments of their environment. He arrived one Saturday morning, carrying a leather satchel filled with notebooks and pencils. Florence greeted him with polite unease, while John, eager to have his beliefs validated, welcomed him warmly. The twins, dressed in simple cotton dresses, peeked from behind their mother's skirt with shy curiosity. McLean began with simple conversation. "What games do you like to play?" he asked. Gillian responded quickly. "Tea parties," Jennifer added, "with Susan and the rabbit." McLean glanced at Florence, noting the specificity. He asked, "And who are Susan and the rabbit?" Gillian rolled her eyes as though the question were silly. "They're ours. Susan is mine. The rabbit is hers," she said, pointing at her sister. He asked about the park, the school, the church. Each time, the girls offered details that exceeded what they should have known at their age. Jennifer described the sound of the swings at the park, the very creak that Mary, Florence's sister, had noted. Gillian explained the route to school with exact turns, even mentioning the bakery's red door. McLean pressed further. "How do you know these things?" he asked. Jennifer shrugged. "Because we were there before." Gillian nodded in agreement, adding, "Before we came here." He scribbled furiously into his notebook, his handwriting small and dense. Later that night, he wrote a more reflective entry. "These children speak of experiences with conviction, not as if they are inventing stories, but recalling them. There is no hesitation, no searching for words. Their tone carries the weight of memory rather than imagination. And yet, memory of what?" Over the following weeks, McLean visited several more times, conducting what he called informal sessions. He showed the girls photographs of places around town. To his astonishment, they identified the school and park without error, even though Florence insisted they had never been taken there. When presented with pictures of unfamiliar locations, they shrugged and looked bored. The selectivity of their recognition troubled him most. In one session, McLean asked Jennifer about her recurring dream. She described the car, the sound, the pain in her hip. She then added a detail that startled even Florence. After, I floated up and looked down at Mama crying. McLean, trained to interpret such imagery as metaphor, found himself shaken. He recorded it in his notebook with underlined emphasis, adding the comment, "This exceeds the usual constructs of childhood imagination. It suggests perspective beyond lived experience." When asked separately, Gillian spoke of her own dream. "I fell and hit my head. I saw blood. Then I was very tired. And I slept. When I woke up, I was here again." She spoke with calm certainty, her words chilling in their simplicity. McLean began to wrestle with contradictions. On the one hand, he could argue that the twins' memories were products of suggestion, scraps of overheard conversation, unconscious cues from grieving parents. On the other, the precision of detail, combined with the physical marks and dreams, resisted such easy dismissal. In his private report, he wrote, "It is possible that the Pollock twins are absorbing information indirectly, though their parents insist the accident is not discussed in their presence. Alternatively, we may be witnessing an extraordinary manifestation of unconscious memory, yet the mechanism remains elusive. I cannot, however, fully reject the possibility of phenomena that extend beyond conventional psychology." Florence read portions of his notes when he shared them. To her, they brought no comfort. "You see," John said, triumphant, "even a man of science cannot deny it." But Florence saw only confirmation of her fears. Her daughters were being dissected, their words reduced to data, their lives turned into a case study. She wondered if they would ever be allowed to be ordinary children. The sessions ended after several months, not because the questions were answered, but because McLean admitted he had reached the limits of his discipline. "I cannot explain it," he confessed to Florence one afternoon. "I can only record what I've seen. Perhaps in time, others will understand more than I do." He closed his notebook, leaving behind pages filled with testimony that would, decades later, become part of the official archive on the Pollock twins. But for Florence, the unanswered questions only deepened her dread. Science had come to her doorstep, and even science had walked away unsettled. The past, it seemed, would not release its grip on her daughters, no matter how many notes were taken or how many explanations were attempted. And soon, as the twins continued to grow, their own sense of identity would begin to shift. No longer merely recalling fragments, they would start to assert who they believed themselves to be, opening the family to a new and even more disturbing chapter. As the twins entered their 5th year, something changed in the tone of their recollections. Until then, their words had been fragments, names of toys, details of places, echoes of pain. But now, those fragments began to assemble into something more formidable. Identity. No longer were they children parroting stray details. They began to declare with certainty who they believed they were. It started with Gillian. One afternoon, while she and Jennifer played in the garden, Florence overheard them arguing. Gillian, her hands on her hips, in a stance so reminiscent of Joanna that Florence felt a chill, shouted, "I'm the older one. You're the little sister." Jennifer crossed her arms, frowning. "No, I'm me. I'm Jennifer. I'm not dead." The words struck Florence like a blow. She rushed outside, demanding what they meant, but the girls only looked at her innocently, as if they had said nothing strange. In the days that followed, the declarations became more frequent. Gillian often referred to herself as Joanna. When asked what she meant, she would insist, "I was her before. I remember being older. I remember taking care of her." She pointed at Jennifer when she said it, her tone protective but also commanding, the way Joanna had once spoken to Jacqueline. Jennifer's responses were more conflicted. Sometimes she agreed, slipping into Jacqueline's role without hesitation. Other times, she rejected it with startling intensity. "I'm not Jacqueline," she snapped once, clutching her rabbit. "I never died. That was someone else." Her words left Florence shaken. Was Jennifer fighting against a memory that pressed too heavily on her? Or was she instinctively rejecting the idea that her life belonged to another? The divergence unsettled John less than it did Florence. To him, it was evidence that the pattern was perfect. Joanna had returned as Gillian, Jacqueline as Jennifer. Their arguments were simply the continuation of a relationship interrupted by tragedy. But to Florence, it felt like her daughters were being torn between two selves, pulled into identities that were not entirely their own. The tension between them spilled into daily life. During play, Gillian often assumed the role of older sister, directing games, assigning roles, and chastising Jennifer for mistakes. Jennifer sometimes went along, but just as often she resisted. One evening, when Gillian scolded her for arranging the dolls wrong, Jennifer threw the rabbit across the room and shouted, "I don't want to be her. I'm not Jacqueline." She burst into tears, and Florence gathered her into her arms, whispering comfort, while Gillian stood nearby with an expression of both confusion and hurt. Florence confided in her diary, "The girls are no longer just speaking memories. They are living them. Gillian is convinced she is Joanna, and Jennifer does not know what she is. It is tearing them apart, and I do not know how to stop it." Visitors noticed the change as well. Mary, Florence's sister, observed one afternoon that Gillian carried herself with uncanny maturity, offering advice and even comforting words to her sibling. "It's as though she's older than she is," Mary remarked. "She speaks with a kind of authority I've only ever seen in adults." By contrast, Jennifer seemed increasingly anxious, withdrawn at times, then explosively defensive when the subject of Jacqueline arose. The psychologist McLean returned briefly during this period and recorded in his notes, "The identities of the twins appear to be solidifying in divergent ways. Gillian accepts, even embraces, the idea of continuity with Joanna. Jennifer alternates between acceptance and rejection, indicating psychological conflict. This may, in time, resolve into either integration or denial. What cannot be denied, however, is that both display knowledge and behaviors consistent with the deceased siblings." Florence began to fear the toll it was taking on Jennifer most of all. The nightmares continued, often leaving her exhausted and fragile. Once, after waking from a particularly violent dream, she clung to her mother and whispered, "I don't want to go back. Please don't let them make me go back." Florence did not know who they were, the car fate god, but the plea broke her heart. For Gillian, meanwhile, the acceptance of being Joanna seemed to bring a strange kind of peace. She spoke fondly of memories as though they were her own childhood recollections, often smiling when recalling games or songs. Yet this calmness unsettled Florence almost as much as Jennifer's turmoil. Her daughter spoke too easily of a life she had never lived, as though she belonged more to the dead than to the living. The family dynamic strained under the weight of these divergences. John, steadfast in his belief, urged Florence to embrace the miracle. "They are proof," he insisted, "proof that the soul is eternal. Why should we fear what God has revealed?" But Florence could not see it as a blessing. To her, it was as though her daughters were trapped between two worlds, neither free to live wholly in the present. In the town, the divergence fueled gossip further. Some whispered that one girl was blessed while the other was cursed. Others claimed the family was deluded, projecting grief onto children. The Pollock twins became, in the eyes of many, less like ordinary children, and more like symbols in a debate about the nature of life and death. Florence, however, saw only two small girls, fragile and bewildered, struggling under a weight no child should bear. She prayed that as they grew, the past would loosen its grip, that the names Joanna and Jacqueline would fade into mere echoes. But deep down, she feared that the divergence was only the beginning of greater turmoil. And indeed, as the twins grew older, the unease in the community around them would intensify, for what the family carried within the walls of their home was now spilling outward into the town's consciousness, bringing with it fear, fascination, and conflict that no one could ignore. By the early 1962, Hexamontine was no longer a town simply whispering about the Pollock twins. It was a town divided. What had once been hushed curiosity at the market or after Sunday service now grew into open debate. The children were no longer merely John and Florence's girls, but had become something larger, something symbolic proof to some of divine mysteries, to others of disturbing forces, best left unspoken. In the pews of St. Mary's Church, opinions clashed quietly but fiercely. Some parishioners told Father Lewis that the twins were living miracles, evidence of God's promise that souls endure beyond death. What greater sign of mercy could there be, one woman said, than to return children lost so tragically? Yet others came to the vicar with darker fears. "It is not God's work," muttered an elderly farmer, his hands trembling as he spoke. "Children should not remember death. If they do, it is the devil's hand guiding them." Father Lewis, caught between these extremes, counseled caution, but privately admitted to Florence that he felt unsettled. "The truth is," he said softly, "I do not know what to make of it." Neighbors, too, showed their unease in subtle ways. Some crossed the street to avoid the family, unwilling to let their children play with Gillian and Jennifer. Others brought gifts, as though appeasing forces they could not understand. Florence once opened her door to find a small bundle of rosemary and lavender, tied with string, left silently on the step. It was meant, she later learned, as a ward against restless spirits. The tension became most visible in the schoolyard. By age 5, the twins were ready to begin school, yet the prospect filled Florence with dread. On their first day, other children gathered around with curiosity that quickly turned into whispers. "They say she remembers dying," one boy muttered, pointing at Jennifer. Another chimed in, "And the other says she was someone else before." The twins, oblivious to the weight of these words, played together on the swings, but Florence saw the stares, the way other parents exchanged uneasy glances, and her heart sank. At the local shop, she overheard conversations she was not meant to hear. "It's not right," said one woman, voice hushed but sharp. "Children should not carry such memories. It'll bring misfortune." Another replied, "Or perhaps it's proof that souls return, proof we've been blind all along." Their words clung to Florence as she walked home, each sentence a reminder that her daughters were no longer simply her own. Even relatives began to take sides. John's sister, devout in her faith, declared openly that the twins were a blessing. "You must share their story," she urged. "The world needs to know that souls are eternal." But Florence's cousin Mary confided her fears. "It's not a blessing," she said firmly. "It's a curse. I love them dearly, but I fear for them. I fear what this means for all of us." Florence, already burdened by the nightly dreams and daily reminders, now found herself carrying the weight of the town's expectations. In her diary, she wrote, "They look at us as if we are chosen or damned, but I did not ask for this. I only wanted my children to live simple lives, free from what has already been lost." John, by contrast, leaned into the role thrust upon them. He spoke to neighbors with calm conviction, repeating his belief in reincarnation. "It is proof," he would say, "proof that death is not the end." Some nodded eagerly, hungry for hope, while others muttered that he was deceived. For every person who saw the twins as a miracle, there was another who saw them as an omen. The strain of this division seeped into the fabric of everyday life. Invitations to birthday parties became fewer. The girls were often left off guest lists, whether out of fear or discomfort. At church socials, Florence felt the conversations shift as she approached, voices lowering, eyes glancing sideways. It was as though her family had become a mirror in which the entire town saw its fears and beliefs reflected. One evening, after a particularly tense day at the market, Florence broke down in tears at the kitchen table. "We're not living anymore," she whispered to John. "We're surviving in a cage of other people's opinions." John tried to reassure her, but his words only deepened the divide between them. He saw validation. She saw isolation. Meanwhile, the twins themselves remained largely unaware of the storm surrounding them. They played with their toys, argued over dolls, laughed and cried like any children. Yet, every so often, their words reignited the town's unease. Once, when asked by a classmate what they wanted to be when they grew up, Gillian replied cheerfully, "I don't need to grow up. I've already done it once." The other children stared, and by the end of the day, the remark had spread to parents across town. The Pollock home had become both sanctuary and prison, a place where Florence tried to shield her daughters from the weight of expectation, and a place from which gossip leaked no matter how tightly she closed the door. And as the girls grew, Florence feared that the community's unease would shape their lives as much as their uncanny memories did. For if a child cannot escape the gaze of others, how can she ever truly escape the past? By the time Gillian and Jennifer reached their teenage years, the sharp edges of their strange memories began to soften. What had once erupted suddenly in dreams, in play, in spontaneous declarations now emerged only rarely, and with far less clarity. It was as if the past that had haunted them so vividly was retreating, fading like chalk drawings left to the rain. Florence noticed it first in the little things. Jennifer no longer clutched her hip in the night, no longer cried out about cars and screeching wheels. Gillian stopped pointing to places around town with the certainty that she had been there before. The toys that had once served as conduits to memory, Susan the doll, the rabbit with the torn ear, lay neglected in a corner of their room, gathering dust. When Florence picked them up one day and offered them back, the girls laughed lightly and said they were too old for such things. For Florence, the relief was immediate, almost overwhelming. For years she had lived with the fear that her daughters were trapped in lives that were not their own. Now, as they grew into young women, she began to believe they might finally be free. She wrote in her diary, "The shadows are lifting. Perhaps they will grow into ordinary girls after all." And yet, the fading of those memories did not feel like victory. It carried with it a strange sorrow, as though something precious was slipping away. One evening, Gillian confided quietly to her mother, "I used to remember more. It felt so clear. But now, when I try to think about it, it's like a dream I can't quite hold." Jennifer echoed the sentiment. "It's going away, and I don't mind. But sometimes it makes me sad, like I'm forgetting something important." Florence, torn between relief and empathy, told them gently, "Perhaps it's better this way. Perhaps memories belong to their own time." But in her heart, she felt an ache she could not name. Had she not spent years fearing those memories? And now that they were vanishing, why did she feel as though she was losing something once again? John's reaction was different. He saw the fading, not as loss, but as confirmation of his belief. "They needed to remember just long enough," he told Florence, "so that we would know. Now that we have the proof, they are free to live their new lives." He spoke with the calm assurance of a man who believed the mystery had served its purpose. But Florence wondered if he was only comforting himself, clinging to a narrative that still left too many questions unanswered. The community, too, began to move on. With fewer incidents to fuel gossip, the town's attention shifted back to the ordinary cycles of harvests, markets, and church services. The twins, no longer the subjects of daily whispers, slipped into the rhythm of adolescence, school, friendships, the awkward beginnings of independence. To many, it seemed the mystery had resolved itself. Children grow, imaginations fade, and life continues. But the traces of what had been never entirely disappeared. Occasionally, a remark would surface unexpectedly. Gillian, during a history lesson at school, once told a classmate, "I already learned this before long ago." The classmate laughed, assuming it was a joke, but Florence heard the report and felt a familiar chill. Jennifer, when passing the site of the accident years later, grew uncharacteristically silent, her gaze fixed on the road, as though listening for echoes only she could hear. By their mid-teens, such moments were rare enough that even Florence began to doubt the intensity of what she had once witnessed. Reading through her old notebooks, she sometimes wondered if grief had colored her memory, if perhaps she had exaggerated in her desperation to make sense of the impossible. But then she would read the precise details, the names, the dreams, the wounds described, and she would remember the nights of terror, the words spoken with conviction too raw to dismiss. The girls themselves grew increasingly detached from those early years. When relatives occasionally brought up the strange things they had once said, Gillian would laugh and wave it away. "I don't remember that," she would say. Jennifer, more serious, sometimes frowned and admitted, "I used to feel something, but it's gone now." Neither seemed eager to revisit the past, as if the memories belonged to someone else entirely. For Florence, the fading brought both solace and unease. She wanted her daughters to be free, to live lives unburdened by ghosts. But she could not escape the question, had those memories truly been theirs, or had they been echoes of souls returned? And if the latter, where did those souls go now? slipping quietly out of reach. In the quiet of her home, she sometimes opened the old boxes again, the toys, the dresses, the notebooks, filled with her handwriting. She ran her fingers over the pages, remembering the terror of Jennifer's screams, the certainty in Gillian's voice. And she asked herself the question she would never resolve. Had she been raising daughters or echoes? The fading of the memories might have closed the chapter for the town, but for Florence, it left an emptiness that no answer could fill. For though the voices of Joanna and Jacqueline no longer spoke through her children, the mystery of what had happened lingered in silence, unresolved, waiting like a question that could never be erased. By the time Gillian and Jennifer stepped fully into adolescence, the extraordinary phenomena of their early childhood had faded into something quieter, less dramatic. To the casual observer, they were ordinary teenage girls studying, making friends, navigating the awkwardness of youth. But if the living voices of Joanna and Jacqueline had grown silent, the written words that surrounded the twins ensured that the mystery could never truly be forgotten. Florence's notebooks formed the foundation of this record. Page after page, filled in a mother's careful handwriting, preserved every remark, every dream, every scar that had once seemed impossible. Some pages were spotted with faint stains, remnants of tears shed as she wrote. Others bore underlined words, moments she feared she would doubt later, desperate to anchor them in ink. In one entry she had written, "If I do not write this down, one day I will tell myself it was imagination, but I must not forget, because I saw it with my own eyes." John, though less methodical than his wife, also left a trail of conviction. His letters to friends, his conversations recorded in church minutes, his statements to visiting researchers all painted a picture of a man who believed unwaveringly in reincarnation. In his correspondence with a cousin in London, he wrote, "If I die tomorrow, remember this. My children proved to me that souls return. There is no death, only change." His words, brimming with faith, became part of the wider debate when they were later cited in discussions about the case. Beyond the family, the notes of Dr. Harold MacLean offered a more clinical record. His journals, bound in brown leather and filled with dense handwriting, described his sessions with the twins in detail. He included sketches of the toys, diagrams of the birthmarks, and verbatim transcripts of conversations. In one entry, dated May 1961, he wrote, "When asked how she knew the route to school, Jennifer looked at me with a kind of weary certainty. 'Because I walked it before,' she said. The statement was delivered without hesitation, as though it were self-evident truth. MacLean's objectivity lent weight to the accounts, ensuring they could not be dismissed as merely parental grief. Neighbors, too, left traces. Mrs. Henderson's diary, discovered years later by her grandchildren, included a brief but chilling entry. "I heard the little one cry in her sleep. The car is coming." It was too clear, too real. I do not know what to make of it. Letters between relatives and friends across the region also survive, fragments of gossip preserved inadvertently. The Pollock twins speak of things they should not know. One cousin wrote to another, "If it is true, it changes everything. If it is not, then it is the cruelest trick grief has ever played." Together, these records formed a patchwork archive, scattered across households, parishes, and academic files. Decades later, researchers who pieced them together marveled at the consistency. Different voices, different perspectives, yet the same core story. Two children born into a grieving family, who remembered, with impossible clarity, the lives of the sisters who had died before them. Florence, for her part, could never decide whether she was relieved or burdened by the survival of these records. Part of her longed for the memories to fade completely, for the notebooks to be tucked away and forgotten so her daughters could live without their shadow. Yet another part of her recognized their importance. Without them, the story might vanish, dismissed as a trick of grief and imagination. With them, the mystery endured, demanding attention from those who came after. She once wrote in her diary, "I keep these notes for the future, for someone braver or wiser than me. Perhaps they will know what it means. I only know what I saw. That must be enough." The twins themselves, as they grew older, seemed indifferent to the preservation of their story. When MacLean returned briefly to collect his final notes, Gillian shrugged and said she remembered bits and pieces, but that most of it was gone. Jennifer, more serious, told him, "I don't want to remember. I want to be just me." McLean respected their wishes, yet he continued to write, certain that their story held significance beyond their own lives. By the mid-1960s, the Pollock case had entered a new phase. It was no longer the raw, unfolding drama of children who spoke of past lives. It was now a collection of testimonies, carefully preserved, debated, and studied. For Florence, the story had shifted from lived terror to enduring record. For John, it had become proof that could outlast even his own faith. And for the wider world, it was material data, evidence, a puzzle that could neither be solved nor ignored. The voices of the twins had grown quieter, but the words written about them ensured that the silence would never be complete. As the years passed and the twins grew into ordinary young women, the extraordinary story of their early childhood did not vanish, it transformed. It was no longer just the private burden of a grieving family, nor merely the whispers of a divided town. It had become a question that echoed far beyond Hexamontine, a question that lingered in the halls of universities, in the pews of churches, in the margins of journals and diaries. What had truly happened in the Pollock home? One explanation, offered by skeptics, was coincidence. Children are imaginative, they argued, and memory is fragile. Perhaps Gillian and Jennifer absorbed subtle cues, snatches of conversation, unspoken grief reflected in their parents' eyes. Perhaps they repeated fragments they barely understood, and adults, desperate for meaning, filled in the rest. To those who favored this view, the case was not a mystery at all, but a lesson in how grief shapes perception, how the human mind constructs patterns from chaos. Others suggested psychological imprinting. Florence and John, still devastated by the loss of Joanna and Jacqueline, may have unconsciously projected their memories and sorrow onto their surviving children. Children, especially young ones, are remarkably sensitive to the emotions of parents. Could it be that Gillian and Jennifer internalized their mother's sorrow, their father's faith, and gave voice to what the household itself could not say aloud? In this reading, the case was not proof of life after death, but of the profound ways trauma ripples through generations. And yet, the evidence resisted such simple reduction. The toys, named without prompting, the nightmares filled with details never spoken, the birthmarks aligning with fatal injuries, the 17 witnesses who testified independently to impossible recollections. Coincidence could explain one or two fragments, perhaps even a handful. But the whole tapestry seemed too intricate to dismiss so easily. For some, the Pollock twins represented the most compelling evidence of reincarnation in the modern age. If souls could indeed carry memories into new bodies, then the twins' story was not an anomaly, but a glimpse of a truth that countless cultures had long proclaimed. The idea electrified those seeking proof of the soul's endurance, offering comfort against the terror of finality. To them, Gillian and Jennifer were not simply children, but heralds of a reality hidden beneath the surface of life. Religious leaders, however, were divided. Some embraced the story as divine consolation, evidence that God could restore what had been lost. Others rejected it as dangerous, even heretical. Christianity, after all, speaks of resurrection, but not of reincarnation. For those bound tightly to doctrine, the Pollock twins unsettled the order of things. If souls returned, if children could carry past lives into the present, then what did that mean for salvation, for judgment, for the boundaries of heaven and earth? Beyond faith and skepticism lay another possibility, one that unsettled Florence most of all. What if the twins' memories were neither coincidence nor reincarnation, but something stranger, a kind of echo, imprinted on place and blood, carried not by souls but by the very fabric of reality? Some theorists would later call this residual memory, the idea that trauma leaves marks not only on people but on the world itself, and that sensitive minds, especially children, can tune into those marks like a radio catching signals from the past. If that were true, then perhaps Gillian and Jennifer were not the return of Joanna and Jacqueline, but the receivers of their lingering presence. Florence, reflecting in her later years, never settled firmly on any explanation. She had seen too much to dismiss the memories as invention, but she recoiled from the notion that her daughters were trapped in the past. In one of her final diary entries, she wrote, "Perhaps it does not matter whether they were Joanna and Jacqueline. Perhaps what matters is that love and loss are too vast to vanish. They echo, they endure, and sometimes they find their way back through the mouths of children. For John, the answer remained unshakable. Until his death, he declared that the twins were living proof of reincarnation. His faith crystallized in their early words. To him, their existence was not a question, but a revelation. For Florence, it was a mystery without resolution, a weight she carried with both dread and tenderness. For the world beyond, it was an unsolved riddle, filed away in archives and whispered in conversations about the boundaries of life and death. And so the Pollock case endures, not because it provides certainty, but because it refuses to. In its fragments, dreams, toys, birthmarks, testimonies, it offers enough to suggest that something lies beyond our understanding, yet never enough to reveal exactly what. It stands as a reminder that human knowledge is limited, that grief and hope alike shape how we perceive the world, and that sometimes the most haunting questions are those that will not be answered. By the late 1960s, the Pollock twins had grown into young women whose lives, outwardly, bore little trace of the mystery that once surrounded them. They studied, they worked, they made friends, they dreamed of futures as ordinary as those of any girl in Hexamontine. Yet beyond their private lives, the story of their childhood had already taken on a life of its own, a legacy that would outlast them, their parents, and even the town itself. The first stage of that legacy came in the form of academic papers. Dr. Harold McLean, though cautious in his conclusions, submitted a private report to colleagues, describing the case as anomalous and unresolved. His notes circulated quietly, passed among psychologists and parapsychologists intrigued by the possibility of reincarnation. Some dismissed his report as indulgence in fantasy, but others preserved it carefully, recognizing that such cases were rare and valuable to the study of consciousness. Soon, other researchers took up the story. In the 1972nd, scholars in Edinburgh and London began compiling files on cases of the reincarnative type. The Pollock twins featured prominently, alongside reports from India, Burma, and the Middle East, where belief in past lives was culturally accepted. What made the Pollock case exceptional, however, was that it unfolded in the West in a Christian community that had no framework for reincarnation. That fact alone made it a cornerstone in debates about the universality of the phenomenon. Journalists also carried the story beyond academic circles. Articles appeared in magazines, presenting the twins as both curiosity and proof. Headlines declared, "Children who remembered their death," and "The twins who returned." Photographs of Gillian and Jennifer, once shy children clutching toys, now circulated widely. To the public, their story was thrilling, unsettling, and deeply human. Tragedy, mystery, and the possibility of life beyond death entwined in the lives of two ordinary girls. The case reached international attention when it was included in Dr. Ian Stevenson's research at the University of Virginia. Stevenson, a psychiatrist known for his meticulous documentation of past life memories in children, cited the Pollock twins as one of the strongest Western cases. He emphasized the consistency of witness testimonies, the correspondence of birthmarks with fatal injuries, and the specificity of memories. "The case resists dismissal," he wrote, "for it presents evidence beyond coincidence, and it arises in a context where such beliefs were neither expected nor encouraged." His inclusion of the twins in multiple volumes of his work ensured their story became a reference point in debates on reincarnation worldwide. The legacy extended beyond academia. In churches, the case was sometimes raised as a challenge, a thorn in the side of doctrine. Was it possible, parishioners asked, that God's mysteries included cycles of rebirth? Clergy struggled to answer, some denouncing the case as deception, others quietly admitting that it stirred questions too deep to ignore. In the wider culture, the twins became symbols. Documentaries revisited the case, presenting it with grainy photographs and solemn narration. Writers used their story as inspiration for novels and plays, weaving the theme of memory carried beyond death into fiction. Each retelling blurred the line between fact and interpretation, yet ensured that the core of the mystery endured. For Florence, who lived long enough to see her daughter's story enter public discourse, the legacy was bittersweet. She never sought fame, nor did she wish her children to be defined by the past. Yet she understood that the records she had kept, the notebooks filled with her careful observations, had become part of something larger. In her final years, she told a visiting journalist, "I only ever wrote because I wanted to be honest with myself. I never wanted to prove anything. I only wanted to remember what I saw." John, before his passing, embraced the attention wholeheartedly. To him, every article, every book, every academic citation was vindication. "The world must know," he declared to friends, "that souls return. My girls are proof." As for Gillian and Jennifer, their adulthood was marked less by extraordinary memories and more by the quiet pursuit of normal lives. Yet they could never entirely escape the story that had defined their childhood. When asked in interviews, they responded politely but distantly, often saying they remembered little or nothing. Their reluctance only deepened the fascination. To some, their silence was evidence that the memories had faded naturally. To others, it suggested that the weight of the past was too great to carry openly. Decades later, the Pollock twins remain a reference point in every serious discussion of reincarnation. Their story appears in textbooks, in lecture halls, in late-night debates between believers and skeptics. It is cited in arguments about consciousness, about the persistence of identity, about whether memory can truly be explained by the firing of neurons alone. The legacy of the case is not that it answered the question of life after death, but that it kept the question alive. It challenged the assumption that memory is confined to one lifetime, and it invited believers and skeptics alike to confront the limits of what can be explained. And so, the Pollock twins live on not only in their own quiet lives, but in the words written about them, in the questions asked because of them, and in the enduring mystery they embody. In the end, the story of Gillian and Jennifer Pollock is not merely the story of two children in a small English town. It is a mirror held up to human existence itself, reflecting our deepest fears and hopes. At its heart lies a question that has haunted humanity for as long as we have drawn breath. What happens when life ends, and is there something of us that survives beyond death? For the Pollock family, the events were lived in the intimate spaces of their home, cradles and kitchens, schoolyards and sidewalks. For them, it was not an abstract question, but a daily reality. Toys named without prompting, scars in the shape of old wounds, nightmares filled with memories too precise to explain. Theirs was a grief transfigured into mystery, a tragedy that seemed, impossibly, to refuse finality. For the town of Hexham, the case was a test of belief and superstition. It forced neighbors to confront the boundaries of their faith, to question whether the familiar order of heaven and earth might be more complex than they had imagined. For some, the twins were miracles. For others, they were unsettling reminders that the world is not always as it seems. For scholars and researchers, the case became a piece of evidence in a debate larger than any family or town. Was it coincidence? Psychological projection? A rare but natural phenomenon of memory? Or was it something far more radical, a glimpse of continuity across lifetimes? The Pollock twins entered the archives of parapsychology and psychiatry, not because they provided answers, but because they embodied the kind of question that refuses to die. And for us, looking back decades later, the story endures because it resonates with something universal. We all live with loss, and we all wrestle with mystery. The idea that memory might outlast the body, that the essence of who we are might return in new forms, is both terrifying and consoling. Terrifying because it unsettles our sense of identity, consoling because it suggests that love, too, might survive beyond the grave. Yet the Pollock case does not resolve into certainty. Gillian and Jennifer themselves grew up, the voices of Joanna and Jacqueline fading until they became little more than echoes. They chose ordinary lives, leaving the extraordinary to others who would speak for them. Their reluctance is perhaps the most human part of the story. No one wishes to live forever under the shadow of a mystery they did not choose. Still, the records remain Florence's diaries, John's proclamations, Dr. McLean's notes, neighbors' testimonies. Together, they preserve a puzzle that endures like a faint but indelible watermark on history. We cannot unwrite their words. We cannot unhear the cries of a child who dreamed of the car that killed her before she was born. Perhaps the meaning of the Pollock twins lies not in proving reincarnation or disproving it, but in reminding us that human experience is wider than our explanations, that the boundary between life and death, between memory and imagination, between faith and doubt, may not be as fixed as we believe. Theirs is a story that dwells in the in-between, where certainty collapses and only mystery remains. And so the enduring legacy of the Pollock twins is not an answer, but an invitation to wonder, to question, to admit that the world is stranger than we think, an invitation to sit with the possibility that love, identity, and memory are not confined to a single lifetime, but may echo in ways we cannot yet understand. In the quiet moments, when we remember our own losses, when we dream of those we have loved and lost, perhaps we hear the same whisper that moved through Gillian and Jennifer in their